So Zevi, welcome to Parallax Academy.
Pleasure. Firstly, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. A pleasure to discuss these subjects which are close to my heart and mind at all times. I grew up in a Orthodox Hasidic community. Orthodox is something of a modern Jewish term. It's a reactionary term to those things which were deemed heterodoxical, non-Orthodox. It's a bit of a funny term in Jewish history because Jewish history, by and large, is not so concerned with questions of orthodoxy. But be it as it may, it's a term which has become part of the contemporary vocabulary. The second part of the description, the Orthodox Hasidic, the Hasidic part, is a bit more pressing and relevant to the current conversation, and I think more meaningful for me. Hasidic comes from the Hebrew word chesed, which means loving kindness, and it's important to remember the etymology to remember where we come from. And it's a term that gets reused many times throughout Jewish history, going all the way back to biblical and then temple times. But in the modern context, beginning in the 18th century and onwards, it refers to a pietistic movement, a spiritual revival that happens in the Jewish Eastern European landscape, a return to the core values of joy, simplicity, worship, humility, authenticity, primarily. These are a return to those values, and I identify as such as a Hasidic Jew. And growing up in a Hasidic household, one is exposed to the teachings of Hasidism as it's known, which is a form of contemporary Jewish mysticism, which is a brainchild in many ways of Kabbalah, which is the titular subject of this evening's discussion. Mm-hmm. And there was always a sense where I didn't really understand what was being taught in the classes that I was learning in the classes of Hasidut, the classes of Kabbalah as a young teenager. And then when I began to explore mysticism from more of a historical, human, global perspective, things in my own tradition began to click and fall into place. And that was a really fascinating experience as a teenager. And it didn't make any sense to me, firstly, that any other tradition should even be in conversation with what I was learning, because it was such a private, intimate, secret teaching. And then not only was it in conversation somehow, but it gave me clarification and elucidation on subjects which I was struggling to understand within this very, very tight-knit, very indigenous study of my own tradition in its own language, which I thought was very much removed from any external influence and sources and dialogue, really. And I came to learn that what was happening here was much more complex. That firstly, Hasidut was obviously in conversation with Kabbalah, which has been in conversation with many mystical and philosophical traditions for hundreds of years in very, very fruitful dialogue. And that fundamentally, and perhaps this second insight is more important, and this leads to where we are today and what I'm up to, is that the whole mystical enterprise and all the questions of philosophical mysticism is really just a reflection of core human questions and human experiences, right? We experience multiplicity, everyday reality, which is broken up and separate. And then we have also glimpses of a different reality, which is much more unified and whole and unbroken. And the attempt to reconcile those two is what I believe gives birth to mysticism, mystical philosophy in large. And the project which I'm undertaking at Seekers of Unity is to explore that human question, the encounter with the unbroken reality, the wholeness of reality, the peace and bliss that we sense in moments of silent rapture, love, ecstasy, and how we make sense of that with our everyday broken reality, and how we can bridge those two to live a more whole life in the long term. And that's the project of Seekers of Unity, exploring through the lens of my own Jewish Orthodox Hasidic traditions this larger, broader, global conception, experience, and ultimately a hope for a more unified future that we can live in together.
So there's maybe a couple of questions I could pick up on with that, and it seems to me there's a sort of almost like a paradox between the hermetic quality of what you guys do in the Orthodox tradition, which is and the universality that you're speaking of. Could you speak to that a bit? And I understand that. I mean, you were sort of pushing away the word orthodoxy uh-huh. In a sense. And also you are very open and you're speaking on YouTube. And when I lived in Montreal in a Hasidic neighborhood, the guys wouldn't even, the guys in the beards weren't talking to me,
Right.
And I've noticed people like Rabbi Friedman and people like this are becoming popular YouTubers, and that the Jewish tradition is becoming more of, even despite its sort of chosen people mythos, becoming a really universal kind of affair.
Right. Yeah, that's a great observation and a great question, and there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah.
There are two things that come to mind as you're posing the question, and the first is going to be a bit more fundamental, perhaps, and a bit more cliche, perhaps, and the second will be a bit more particular and try to unpack what's actually going on in this moment in history and the theological and historical reasons for that. The first, a bit more cliche truism, is that I think that in order to, there are two types of universality. Let's say there's a universality of someone who has no identity, and therefore they're everything because they're nothing, and they can be everything to anyone because they have no true inner definition of who they are and where they belong. I think there's a second type of universality, which is the one which I strive for and hope to achieve and promote, which is one in which we're so grounded, so deeply grounded in our own particularity, that we've tapped into a place of universality through the particular. And this is an idea which goes all the way back to Plotinus and many, many great mystics, that if we do believe that the universe is fundamentally united, then each aspect, each fragment of it, each fractal manifest the whole in some way, and only when it's fully being itself can it be an expression of the whole, and therefore ultimate particularity and ultimate universality are not a contradiction. That's kind of the more abstract truism which I'm talking about. The second, and I'm kind of moving quickly, and I hope the pace is okay here. The second point, which is more particular to my own tradition and my own lineage, and why it's beginning to be turned outward, which is a phrase which is used, goes back. There's many places to where we could trace this, but a safe place to trace it is to a letter, actually, that the founder of the Hasidic movement in the 18th century, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem, a great mystic, lover, a man of wisdom and truth and peace, a letter that he writes to his brother-in-law. And in the letter, he writes about this, perhaps we could use the term, this shamanic experience that he has. He has this, what's called an ascension of the soul in Hebrew, aliyat haneshama. And on this soul ascension, he arrives at the celestial chamber, the Heichal, the palace of the Messiah. This is what he writes in the letter, in this vision of his. And he asks the Messiah, he paraphrases a quote from the Talmud, and he says, "E matai ka'atimar, when will the master arrive?" Awaiting, Jews are the masters of waiting 2,000 years for the Messiah, for redemption. They say, when? He asks him, when will the master come? And the Messiah answers, when your teachings, when your well springs of wisdom, the water that you have to bring to the world, are spread outwards to the entire world, then I will come, is essentially what he says. And there's a bit more there, but that's the gist of it. And this enigmatic phrase, which is written, as far as we can tell by the hand of the Baal Shem Tov, to his brother-in-law, makes its way down into the Hasidic movement, which is broken up into many dynasties and families and courts, and it's received in different ways. And one particular lineage, beginning with Shner Zalman of Liadi, the Chabad Hasidic tradition, to which I was born into and very proudly belong, takes this line in the letter very, very seriously. It makes it a center of their theological practice, which means that if we do want the Messiah to come, we have to take the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, namely Hasidism, Jewish mysticism, and spread it to the entire world. And that means by word of mouth, by pamphlets, by letters. And today that means by podcasts and YouTube and Zoom. And in some sense, what we're doing here is fulfilling the calling of the Baal Shem Tov. And to break down, if it's sounding a bit obscure, the way that it's explained within the Hasidic tradition is that the messianic reality is not some savior who comes on a white cloud or donkey to vanquish the enemy or to slaughter the dragon. The messianic redemption simply is humans living in a messianic consciousness, a consciousness of unity and oneness and bliss and presence and love. And it is the teachings of mysticism, according to the mystical traditions, which bring to that consciousness. So saying that when these teachings spread across the entire world, then the Messiah will come, is just saying that when the teachings of this consciousness are global, and that consciousness is global, then that is the messianic redemption. It's not a cause and effect. It just that's the mechanism, and it's the content and the effect of it. So if we believe that we have something that we can share with the world, that we can bring people into a state of tranquility and earnestness and bliss and kindness and love, and that is what a redeemed world looks like, that is a messianic reality, then it's our obligation, it's our duty to share that with others, to bring that, and to try and share that gift we have, the well springs of the Baal Shem Tov. And I think that in our language, it's the well springs of the Baal Shem Tov, but for others, it's the well springs of the Buddha, or of the inner teachings of Jesus, or of Nagarjuna, or of Ibn Arabi, or of Shankara, or the great mystics of each tradition that do bring humans to the state of redemption, to the state of ease and goodness and kindness. That's a bit of a more grounded historical explanation of what we're seeing today, and why all these bearded Jews are out there talking about the secrets of Judaism in public.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things also that you made me think about, and one is I'd like to know more about the Hasidic, the Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic tradition, and the feeling I get, and correct me if I'm wrong, in my limited study of these things, is that there's a lot of warmth in that tradition. It's a very warm tradition, and that the Kabbalah itself, and Lurianic Kabbalah and things like that, it can be very cold and abstract and intellectual, and that I sort of, and one of the insights that David Smith gave me was that the two have to be kind of combined. So, I wanted you to talk about Kabbalah this evening, but I wondered if you could also speak on a little, about the Hasidic Kabbalah, kind of the dynamic between those things, and I guess the point of that would be what would the point of studying this stuff be for somebody like me who is working in another tradition? Do I just have an esoteric hobby or whatever, or is there something that I can learn from you and learn from these traditions? And I know there is, because I can feel the tradition. I can feel the transmission of that when I read the Baal Shem Tov or Rebbe Nachman or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Firstly, I certainly hope that there's a lot that you can learn from me and I can learn from you. The Mishnah, 2nd century Jewish text, classic rabbinic text says, "Ezehu chacham," who is wise? Halomed mikol adam, one who learns from every person, and that means from our children, and from the bus driver, and from the street cleaner, and from the lawyer. We can learn from everyone, and that's when we're in wisdom, when we're learning from everyone, and that's a beautiful way to live, in a love of wisdom. That's true philosophy, and a love of people. Therefore, if they're all conduits of wisdom. The question of the relationship between Hasidism and Kabbalah is an interesting one, and the question of the place of fervor and warmth and passion and ecstasy in the Hasidic tradition is a very, very interesting, hotly debated and fascinating one as well. The Kabbalists, as many people know, have a certain schema by which they schematize reality. And when they say reality, they mean God, the world, and the human psyche. They mean those three things simultaneously. The most classic schema that's known of the Kabbalists is the 10 Sfirot.
Yeah.
The 10 Sfirot can be divided up into different groupings, and they can be divided vertically or horizontally. When they're divided horizontally, which means that we put them into groupings one above the other in the classic formulation of the Sfirot as they're known today. Just
a maybe a short interruption, if you don't mind, because this is what people know of as the tree of life that you're speaking of, right?
Correct.
Just so that people know that.
Correct. Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Which thank you. Which refers to a specific configuration of the Sfirot. There are many different configurations, and in a certain format, it's known as the tree of life. This isn't a class on the Sfirot, so we won't get too in depth. But I just want to use this. I want to use the schema of the Kabbalists themselves to try and explain what's going on here. We'll explain the system from the inside if we can. the Kabbalists divide the reality, really. They divide God, the world, and the human psyche into three phases, and then a fourth. Three primary, then a fourth. The first phase, and these groupings are all very fluid and dynamic and organic and alive, and don't think that these are rigid mathematical divisions. These are just heuristic, and they're constantly, think about them constantly moving and flowing one into the other. But with that caveat in place, we begin with what's known as the mochin, the intellectual sphirot, or the cognitive sphirot, the mind, nous, as we may have it in Greek. We move, which is typically chachma, bina, dat, or keter, chachma, bina, depending on how it's being counted. We then move into the primary emotive sphirot, and that is chesed, gvura, tiferet. Then we move into the expressive, which is netzach, hod, yesod. Okay, so we begin with intellect, then emotive, then expressive. That's basically the three.
Can we look at that as sort of non-dual, causal, and concrete, or something like that, like the way the Hindus talk about it?
Yeah, I mean,
something like that.
Yeah. Roughly speaking, to be, and I think Keter sits well with non-dual. I mean, there's obviously, if we're going to make a comparison, we could do it carefully. We can go through bit by bit, but if that's a helpful heuristic, then sure. Mm-hmm. There's a fourth category beneath the expressive yesod, which is malchut, which is a combination which reunites with the non-dual, with Keter and that kind of. But we're going to leave those aside. I'm just trying to make a bit of a broader point here, which is that in the life of God, in the human psyche, in the spiritual development of the Jewish mystic, these things all have to be done in harmony, right? Bringing the sphirot from a state of chaos to a state of order, from a state of toh to tikkun, as it is in Hebrew, is really much of the work of the Kabbalists, is to unite them in this sacred erotic dance, and part of that means having the presence of the intellect, having the presence of the emotion, and having the presence of expression and then fruition. Which means that if we're just going to be intellectual beings, if we're just going to be abstract, cold, rational philosophers, then we're ignoring the rest of the spherotic chain. And what I'm saying is that the Kabbalists, although we may think of some of them as great, powering giants of intellects, ignoring other aspects of their being, that's certainly, I think, a misunderstanding. And these people were trying to, in their own systems, develop a unitive system whereby one could unite themselves from their thought, speech, and action, through their through intellect, emotion, and expression, and unite the masculine and feminine within them, if we're talking about the horizontal as opposed to the vertical. So these are people that are really striving for a deep, deep, deep integration of their entire being. And by uniting and integrating their being, they're uniting the cosmos, right? Because that's the theory, the microcosm and macrocosm. So firstly, I just want to, the point of this is to say is that we should not think of the Kabbalists as cold, abstract, absent-minded philosophers. We should think of them as people that are developing very, very powerful, complex systems that are an attempt to integrate the entirety of the human experience, including emotional expression, love, fear, domination, submission, desire, rejection, all these things into a full harmony so that the universe itself can be harmonized in themselves.
Well, you mentioned you said it was an erotic dance.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting to say that, because again, from the outside, we think of these Hasidic traditions as kind of, again, hermetic and kind of like against the, sort of, I guess this is maybe a Gnostic dualism that we've inherited from certain aspects of Western Christianity, but you mentioned the erotic, and so I wouldn't mind hearing you speak on that if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the Kabbalists, and we can think of the Kabbalists as prudes, we can think of them as Victorian, and these would all be, largely incorrect and often anachronistic, right? The Kabbalistic system is nothing if it is not a deeply, deeply, deeply sexual picture of reality. A sexuality which although does not derive from the same sources as, let's say, the traditions of Tantra, it has more roots in the biblical poetry of the Song of Songs, which is really the Bible for the Kabbalists, deeply erotic and love poem that's attributed to King Solomon. but the entire Kabbalistic system is predicated on the separation that is caused in the act of creation between the divine masculine and the divine feminine, between Kuchabricho and Shechina, between what in Indian traditions we would call Shakti and Shiva. And the entire work of the Kabbalists is to bring love back to the divine, is to reunite the divine. There's a very beautiful turn of phrase from a great scholar of Jewish mysticism today, Moshe Idel, who describes the Kabbalistic practice and protocol and program of mitzvot as the divine aphrodisiac, this attempt to bring love back to the celestial couple, which is really true. That's what the Kabbalists are trying to do in every act in every mitzvah that the Kabbalist does. They say, before they do the act of the mitzvah, the biblical commandments, they say Hashem yichud kuchabrichu shchinte leachada Hashem yudke vavke b'chudash shalom b'shem kol Yisrael, that let this action be done so that the divine masculine kuchabrichu and the divine feminine shchinta can be reunited back into one union in the name of all of Israel. And these are very, very powerful metaphors, and we're not talking here about some Greek god who's Zeus and Jupiter and Persephone. We're talking about really the energies of the cosmos itself. We're talking here about the anima and animus of the human psyche. We're talking about here about the positive and negative charge of every eon in the cosmos. We're talking about the very balance of reality, which is held between being and nothingness, that needs to be constantly brought into balance. And that is the sexual activity, the rising and setting of the sun. The dance between the moon and the sun is a deeply sexual dance for the Kabbalists. It's a deeply erotic reality. What is Eros, after all? Eros is to be in full presence, to be an entirely fully manifested with the intensity of being that only sexuality can conjure for some people. But it's not limited to sexuality. We can be erotic in so many ways, which means we can be so fully present and manifest. And the Kabbalists are trying to manifest reality. They're trying to make reality present. They're trying to make presence itself present. And they feel an exile of presence. They feel an exile of God. God leaving the Garden of Eden means that we've lost something. We no longer see the world the way that Adam did, and in the freshness and power that it has. And the sexuality is to come back into that ecstatic relationship with reality itself. We, the humans, are the divine feminine for the Kabbalists, and we're coming back to the earth, to the sky, to nature around us, and we're reuniting. So it's erotic.
So interesting. You said that the human being is the divine feminine. That means men and women both. Like embodiment itself is the divine feminine, right?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, specifically the body. The human body is the divine feminine. The human soul is the divine masculine. And it's a very fascinating way that the Kabbalists conceptualize gender. There's been many books written on this, but basically speaking, the relationship between human and God is the relationship between the feminine and the masculine, and that is regardless of one's particular gender orientation. That these are sort of more macro genders that we're speaking about here.
Yeah. And I also have heard, I was listening to somebody talk about Moses de Leon and the Zohar in the 12th and 13th century, and saying that it was a bit like Dante's Inferno or something. It came about at the same time. And they're saying that what it really celebrated was the divine feminine. And it seems like in the West, in religion, that masculine is kind of in ascendance for most of the time, and there's these moments of spiritual blossoming where the divine feminine becomes powerful. And I think the same thing in the tantric movements in India, right? Most of the ordinary Buddhism is quite, like Zen, very masculine, and then there's these tantric movements that come in that are much more expressive and powerful and erotic and bodily. So that's just one of the reasons why I was very attracted to learning about this tradition and finding out things like that the word for Holy Spirit in Judaism is feminine, or things like that. I don't know if that's true or not. I might have a sort of a bit of a Reader's Digest version of the whole thing, and you could inform me of the subtleties of it. But
it's a really fascinating thing that happens in the 13th century. What happens for various reasons is there's a real shift to the divine feminine, and that happens both in Judaism and Christianity. There's a very strong veneration of the Virgin Mary that blossoms in the Iberian Peninsula at the time, as well as when the text of the Zohar becomes first revealed, public light in the 13th century. There is this new character, or rather this readopted character, this reappropriated character of the Shekhinah. Shekhinah is a term that we know from the Bible and from Talmudic literature, but she takes on this entire divine persona, the divine indwelling, the feminine, and if there's one character who's really the central metaphysical protagonist of the Zohar, it is the Shekhinah, it's the divine feminine, in exquisite and incredible ways. I know many incredible contemporary women scholars of Zohar who are doing a lot of work on this character of the Shekhinah in the Zohar, and they're blown away by the depth of profundity of the intricacies of the feminine that are being explored here by presumably male authors in this text of the Zohar. That's still in very gripping and very challenging and very subversive and very beautiful ways. It's interesting, this return to the feminine, and there's a lot to speak about in a Kabbalistic and Hasidic context. Carl Jung said once that the most significant theological move of the century was the reincorporation of Mary into the Trinity, to move it from a Trinity to a quaternity, and he may have over exaggerated how that was happening, and there may still be what to be done there, but in the Kabbalistic system, the return or the ascension of the feminine is really the entire picture of it. It's the entire telos of the Kabbalistic system is for the ascendancy of the feminine, is for the ascendancy of Malchut. And this may sound like contemporary feminist jargon, but what I'm talking about here is very ancient mystical theory, which goes back long before any contemporary political or movements as such, and it's been certainly interestingly reinterpreted and reread in the light of modern movements and how one may influence each other or be fulfilling one another. But before we get to that, the basic Kabbalistic idea is, as we laid out earlier, there are 10 Sefirot beginning from Keter running down to Malchut. Malchut is synonymous or can be sort of switched out with Shekhinah, with the divine feminine.
Mm-hmm.
Malchut is the feminine. Malchut is the womb, and the basic idea is built on a rabbinic midrash. A lot of Kabbalah is built on earlier rabbinic sources. There's a really fascinating midrash. The midrash, for those that don't know, is basically a body of texts that's composed from the turn of the millennia and about the next 800 years onwards, which reads the biblical text and it sees a lot of things that are missing, and it fills in all the in between the lines of the biblical text. It's this super fan fiction on the Bible in some sense, and it's an exquisite treasure house of human and Jewish genius that's explored slowly over the years by Jewish sages and particularly by Kabbalah. One of the great failures of Jewish philosophy, according to historians, is its lack of attention to this treasure house of midrash, of this lore, L-O-R-E. So there's one particularly fascinating midrash which records a debate between the sun and the moon, and this is very typical for the midrash. The midrash knows it has ears everywhere. So God creates the sun and the moon. And according to the midrash, and the midrash is doing this based on very specific, very fine toothpick readings of the grammar of the biblical language, and I won't get into exactly how it knows this and why it knows this, but for those that want to know, we can explore and unpack it in detail. The midrash surmises from this intricate reading of the text that when God creates the sun and the moon, they're created as two equal luminaries. They're the same size, the same luminescence, and a conversation in heaven ensues between the moon, the sun, and God. The moon, this great luminary, comes to God and says, what did you do here? what kind of nonsense is this? You made two equally bright luminaries in the sky, and it says there can't be two kings with the same crown. What business is this? One of us, you have to bring some balance here. And God says, you know what? Fine, I'll take what you're saying. I'll listen. I'll take this seriously, and I'll make you smaller. I'll shrink you down so that the sun will be the main show and you'll be the sideshow. And the moon, obviously eating its own words, gets shrunken down. It's what we would call in contemporary studies of mythology an etiological myth, a myth to explain the origin of something. So we see a smaller moon and a bigger sun, and this gives us the background picture, and it's tied into its own methodology of hermeneutics, reading the text. But and in that and that's the role of the moon. The moon has been banished from its glory, and it's been shrunken in the presence of the sun, and it has no light of its own. It only reflects back the light of the sun, and that's what we see of the moon. And even then, the moon constantly is waxing and waning. It's shrinking. It's never the sun is always the sun. It's always great and bright and full and round. So that's the medrash.
Well, there's also, can I just put a little footnote in here,
sure,
if you don't mind? Like,
please,
the tantric traditions, the inner yogas, the feminine is solar, and the masculine is lunar, because the masculine is the reflecting. It's the intellect which reflects on things. So it's a kind of reversal of that mythology. So this kind of tells us that you can kind of like, all of these systems don't have a sort of absolute, maybe Platonic.
Right.
There's not like this, ultimate archetype, but they're different from whichever perspective you look at them.
Right. That's beautiful. I appreciate that. And and I take that's a well taken point, that these aren't absolute. They're here to be played with, and they're here to be learnt through. That's also interesting because reflection and rationalization actually, according to the Kabbalists, takes place in Bina, which is the feminine. And creativity is the masculine, and this is not necessarily the way we think about these categories in a contemporary Western society. Anyhow, putting that to the side. And then in the Midrash, God says that don't worry, like when in the end of times, when things are brought back to the balance, the moon will be returned to your former glory. The Kabbalists take this text and they read this in their own direction. They read the moon as a symbol for the Shekhinah, for the divine feminine, for Malchut, for the final sphere. Why? Because according to the Kabbalists, the feminine is that which is composed of lack. The masculine is the potency, it is the seed for regeneration, and the feminine is the vacuum, is the womb which receives that potency and then creates something from it. It takes the light of the sun and reflects it back. I don't mean to. I hope none of this is coming across as dated or sexist or chauvinistic. I'm just simply describing the way that the Kabbalists describe these very complex types. Okay, good. So the moon is this Malchut. The moon is that which is Letzla Legarmaklum, which has nothing of its own, which receives and shines back. This is also described as the king who has no power besides the power of the people, who shines the power of the people back to them. This is an interesting crossing gender metaphor. And what the Kabbalists say is that the whole goal, that this medrash, this fanciful story between the sun and the moon, is really a very, very deep cosmic, psychological, spiritual teaching, which talks about the very nature of being itself, that things do not stay in balance. You cannot have two equally powerful forces. One will have to be diminished. But the entire point of this whole process of creation and redemption is to take that which has been diminished and return it back to its place, where it can then be again that which is shining forth, and then the circle continues in some sense. And so this very idea of the ascension of Malchut back to Keter, back to the first sphere, which then becomes Keter Malchut, right? The crown of kingship is the ascension of the feminine. This Halaut HaMalchus, the ascension of the feminine, is so central to the Kabbalists. And part of the suppression and oppression and rejection and marginalization of the body, of nature, of the feminine, are all part of this shrinking of the moon. And the role, the entire goal of the Kabbalists is this question of how do we return the moon to its former glory? How do we return the body, the nature, the feminine to its former glory? And so therefore, when this shift emerges in the 13th century, this very rich poetic mythological description of Shekhinah, it is part of this immense project of restoring the balance between the intellect and the body, between the spirit and nature, and it's a very sophisticated process. For example, in many mystical traditions, materiality is seen as privation, as absence of God. This is a classic Neoplatonic idea. For the Kabbalists and then for the Hasidic thinkers, this could not be further than the truth. The most intense presence of divinity is in material, is in matter itself, is in the ground, is in the beingness, the richness of materiality is where the divine is, and that is a return to the feminine. And this is the return of the moon. I'm kind of trying to throw out wide nets and draw big sketches here, but the point is that it's not just a happenstance that the feminine becomes this important character in the 15th century, but rather it's this very, very elaborate, rich process that is a return to all things feminine and a re-embracing of that entire process.
Do you know the work of Ian McGilchrist? Have you looked at that?
Master and his emissary.
I was just thinking about when you were saying, I was thinking about how this sort of, he talked about it, periods of renaissance or periods of flourishing. It's when, like, I guess it would be when Beta and Chokma come together, or when the masculine and the feminine sort of meet, and then you have this flourishing, and then they separate again. And that this is the history of culture is always that process. Yeah.
I think we live under a great misconception, which is that there's good and evil, right? That there's bad and there's the right, and that whether it's us and them, and it's left or right, or it's men and women, someone's to blame and someone's got it right. And if we can only get rid of the people that are doing it bad and embrace the side that's doing it good, or it's the spirit and matter, or the body, the soul, whatever.
Dualism.
It's these very basic dualisms that really, like, so I mean, if you think that we're beyond dualisms that penetrate us from deep old metaphysical places, just open up Twitter and you'll see it's very much alive, right? And the deep wisdom of the mystics is that the way that we come back into wholesome integration is by really embracing the beauty of each side of the coin and seeing how without night there is no day, and without winter there is no summer, and without masculine there is no feminine. And the most beautiful thing is when they're able to come into one another and able to join in that balance, in that dance, in that rich relationship, when we can embrace dusk and sunset as the points where darkness and light kiss. And we're not trying to banish the dark or eradicate the dark. We're trying to embrace them fully and play with both of them. We play with dark and light, and we create art. We play with masculine and feminine. We create sexuality. We play with heaven and earth, and we create the true spirit. And it's that further embrace which I think is where we see the maturest mystics going, and which I think we need so strongly today. We need I'm not a particularly political person, but we need both conservation and innovation. We need people who are going to hold on to values and people who are going to challenge values to push us further. We need each other, and so long as we're seeing each other as enemies, then there's no way to progress and to continue to dance to somewhere more beautiful.
I think that's why I love this model of the sphere out of
I don't hear
life.
you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I do.
Yeah. Sorry. I was going to say, I think one of the reasons why I love this model of the tree is that you have the left and the right and the center. And, if you look at the yin yang, it's always a duality, and it's black and white. But there are a series of triads, or a series of dynamic expressions, which are rooted in the earth, and the earth is equal to, Keter is equal to, or something like that. Anyway, forgive me if I'm not understanding this, but normally we want one side. We want we would like to have the masculine without the feminine, or we'd like to have, and I was wondering about, I've been thinking about the Gavora, right, which is the dark side of God, right, or something like that, right? It's the ruthless aspect of creation, and how do we come to terms with that? And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah. It's a very. I think what you're pointing to is very important here. It's what we're getting at is that the Kabbalistic system, the tree of life, which contains both sides. It contains the right and the left. And the Sefirot, we spoke before about the the vertical,
and the integrative aspect.
Yeah. So here we have the horizontal, where we have on the right side, we have Chachma, Chesed, Netzach. On the left side, we have Bina, Gvura, Hod, and then in the middle we have Keser Das, Tiferes, Yesod, Malchus. And the idea is, and basically the right is the masculine, the left is feminine, the right is expressive, is the affirmative, is the positive, positive and negative, as in, like, we would use those terms almost, in physics. The left is, and Gvura, by the way, Gvura is associated sometimes with darkness, and it's sometimes associated even with the demonic, but Gvura simply is also associated with justice, and with boundaries and restriction, and with knowing when to say no. Chesed always says yes. Gvura says no. And if we don't know when to say no, not only do we lose our boundaries and lose ourselves and we can be abused as such, but we also can't be saying yes if we don't know how to say no. and so Gvura is equally important. And when you have Chesed, when you have yes and Gvura and no, when you have kindness and justice together, then you have Tiferes, then you have harmony. And that's really what it's about. There's, again, to call back to the Medrash, because the Kabbalists never go anywhere without the Medrash with them. There's a Medrash that says that when God wanted to create the world, God was contemplating which attribute will God create the world with, and God thought to create the world based on the attribute of justice, of Gvura, sometimes called Tzedek. There's different terms that it gets called, and God saw that if he built the world on that principle, that the world wouldn't exist. That if everything was done by the letter of the law, then humans would not get very far. That we need forgiveness, we need compassion, we need to be able to color outside the lines and continue. And God therefore says, Olam Chesed Yibana, I'll build a world of kindness. Excuse me. And in some ways, you see this reflected in the biblical narrative, right? God creates the world, there's a generation, and there's sin, and what does God do? God destroys the generation, right? He floods the whole world with Noah. Then there's the generation of the Tower of Babel, and God disperses them all. There's all of these, basically, it's all of these iterations of, and for the Kabbalists, these are not necessarily historical events, they're cosmic and psychological events of God attempting.
Right, that's important, right? Because we tend to look at these things mythologically as events that happened in history, but I think the Kabbalistic lens of it is really, we're looking at dynamic expressions of being, right?
Correct.
Rather than some sort of,
correct,
mythological history.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. And this is a much more profound reading of the biblical text as far as it goes. And in this sense, it's myth, not in the sense of a story which is untrue, but it's a truth told in the form of a story. That's the mythological character here. And then God, Adam comes around, and Adam for the Kabbalists, sorry, not Adam, Abraham comes around, and Abraham for the Kabbalists represents the sphere of Chesed. And in that iteration of reality, now beginning with Abraham, beginning with Chesed, a new reality comes into being, a reality from which God can begin to redeem and reveal and give Torah, to give wisdom to the people, at least within the Jewish telling of that cosmic story. And the point here basically is that it's not that Gvura is bad. It's not that justice is wrong. It's that we can't build a world just on justice. We cannot build our relationships just on right and wrong. If any of us we're in any kind of relationship, we know that we're human and we make mistakes. I think as children, we have a sense of very, very stark justice, because children are much more innocent than adults, and innocence can deal with justice because they go hand in hand together. But once you're an adult and you realize that we make mistakes and we screw up sometimes, then we need kindness and we need forgiveness, and we need that for ourselves, and we need that for each other. And that's where you need Chesed and Gvura to come together.
Where does beauty fit in that spectrum?
So that's a good question. There's a very interesting phenomena here, which is that the Sfirot have these kind of abstract names, and they're translated directly, verbatim, from these abstract names. So beauty is a translation of Tiferet, which is that point of conjunction between Chesed and Gvura, between loving kindness and justice, severity. And it's weird to call it beauty, because beauty is not really a helpful term to make sense. And this happens for many of the Sfirot. Yesod is foundation. What is foundation? How is foundation the balance between victory and and Hod, which is translated as splendor. Like these, if you just translate directly to English, it doesn't make a lot of sense. What you need to do is you first need to understand what's happening here cosmically, psychologically, spiritually, and then you can see why these words are being chosen. And the reason why beauty is chosen is because when you have the perfect mixture and balance and harmony between loving kindness, between affirmation, between giving, and between gvura, between right and justice and boundary, when those things are in perfect balance, what emerges then is the beautiful symmetry of beauty itself. Then those two things can be held together. And we don't just have someone who is gouging themselves on kindness and is destroying. You can destroy a world with love as much as you can destroy a world with justice. When you have them together, then you have something beautiful. And that's why it's called Tiferet, because Tiferet is because that harmony is beautiful. When we look for beauty in a human face, we're looking for the harmony and symmetry of those things in the face. And for the Kabbalists, this spiritual physiognomy of the divine face is the parts of the divine face is what's being expressed beautifully when we have this conjunction.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking as you were speaking about the idea of, when all of these attributes, I guess, of the tree, the negative aspects of them is when they exist in isolation. And isn't there another tree that sort of expresses that, which is like the hellish version of the tree, or
right.
Which, and I also thought about how if you're just in Gavora, it's tyrannical, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the tyrannical father in a sense.
Yes.
Whereas if you're just in I'm forgetting them, and please forgive my terrible pronunciation of Hebrew words. The other one, you're in the devouring mother. If you're just in this sort of compassion, which the Buddhists would call idiot compassion,
right?
You just become the devouring mother, and so the two have to. Again, it's the question of integrating the two.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's a fascinating discussion. These different versions of this erotic tree, and there's a few different examples there's a few different models that are put forward to explain what's going on inside of us and in reality. One, there's two trees obviously in the biblical narrative in the beginning of Genesis. There's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, and the Kabbalists do juxtapose those against one another and ask. It's the tree of knowledge of right and wrong, of good and evil, of distinction, of duality, and life. There isn't that distinction. Life is just life, right? There's no evil when the tiger tears apart the gazelle on the prairie. It's life happening. It's the intermingling of chesed and gvura that is life itself. In a court of law, in the tree of knowledge, you cannot tear apart someone like a gazelle. You're gonna have to face justice if you do that, and rightfully so. So that's two models, and those two trees face each other. There's also the tree of what's known as the side of holiness, and then there's the tree of the other side, the literally sitra achra, other side in Aramaic, and that's the tree of evil, although that's not really the word that the Kabbalists are using. It's the tree of the other side. It's the tree which parallels the holy. It's the tree which is associated with the demonic, with the klipot, with the shells of reality, as opposed to the fruit of reality. I'm reticent to use sort of standard English words here because we have Christian theological assumptions when we say words like evil and demonic, and the Kabbalists have their own set of connotations, and that's important to keep in mind. And so excuse my use of English. There's also, and we mentioned this earlier, that there's different configurations when the Sefirot are not even in a tree. There's the Sefirot as they are in a line. There's the Sefirot as they are in a circle.
Sort of concentric circles as well.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Yeah. So the line is archetypally male. It's the phallic. It's the penis, and the circle is the womb, is the archetypally female. And basically what happens is the Kabbalists see the cosmos being generated in this iterative process where it fails and fails again until finally God gets it right. And what it means is basically that in all of our processes of creation, and relation, we fail and we fail and we fail until we finally get it right. And that is divine. To be divine is to be imperfect, is to fail and try again, not to get it right the first time. That's a big mistake. It's a very the God of the Kabbalists is a God who fails and fails and fails until and still trying to get it right. So one of the first failures is when the Sefirot are aligned.
The God who fails. That's not exactly mainstream theology, is it?
No. And I'm trying to say that the Kabbalists are not mainstream. They're not Catholic or Protestant or even Orthodox, and all these terms, orthodoxy as well. I'm trying to distance that term because I don't think they're Orthodox. I think that they're doing something heterodoxical in their own way, and that's why I don't love that term. But so one of the iterations is the Sefirot all in a line in this divine phallic, and it's a very anthropomorphic description of how God inseminates reality into being through like spurting the divine life through the divine phallus, through the Sefirot and the divine energy, the seed flowing through them. And what happens is, get this, is that because the Sefirot can only see the one before it and after it, because they're all in this linear progression, and these don't like, these things are meant to be abstract, and don't think that there's some sort of billiard balls of Sefirot. These are very abstract concepts. Because there's a linearity to this process of emanation and revelation, there's a sense where they lack the crystalline structure where they can see that there's left and right, and they can see above and below, and they only see in front of them and behind them. And what happens is that there emerges this there emerges this instability. You can think about like these atoms that are just in a string of atoms that they're going to pop and collapse until they find their perfect crystalline structure. Well, we can think about this in a relationship, when all we see is, in a family, we only see above and below us. I only have my older sibling and younger sibling, and there's jealousy and rivalry in one way, and there's insecurity and fear in the other direction. And I don't see how I'm part of this very beautiful complex structure where there's mother here and father there and niece here and nephew there and neighbor here, and I'm surrounded by this very beautiful crystalline structure. It's not just left and right or front and back, and
that's
that,
the narrow hierarchical sort of.
Exactly, and that collapses. That collapses. There's a sense, there's this joke that when you're driving, right, anyone that's driving faster than you is speeding, and anyone that's driving too slow or slower than you is a slowpoke that's holding up traffic. It's like I'm perfectly in the middle, and everyone else is wrong. And it's like no, you're part of this very big cosmic web, Idra's web, as the Hindus will have it. And when we can look not just up and down, not just front and back, but we can look left and right, and we can see what's happening in a bigger picture. I almost get the image of like the prisoners in Plato's cave. They can only see the Sefirot, only see in one direction. The flow only goes one direction, and the flow needs to move, it needs to dance, it needs to go and come in complex ways. And these are all, and that's a failure. Then we have the circular form of this Sefirot, which is a bit better. But even then, until we finally come to the crystalline structure of the tree of life, that's when we can have what's known as the parts of the face. And the face, right? The parts of his face, and it's not, the face is not a line. You don't have eye, nose, and it's not a circle, right? But it's the parts of it. It's two here, it's one here, it's two here, it's one here. It's like this very crystalline, complex structure, which the Kabbalists map on with the Sefirot as well.
So the body is also the Sefirot too.
100%.
The human body is kind of the microcosm of the.
Yes. Yeah, there's a very famous text in Tikkun Zohar, a late redaction of Zohar text, a very well-known text, Particularity, which describes the Sefirot, maps it onto the human body, and it places, and we could read a bit more into it. We could place Chachma and Sefirah into the right and left hemisphere of the human brain. Human brain. You mentioned Ian McGilchrist before. Then Dat would be in the human throat. Chesed is the right hand. Gvura is the left hand. Torso, Tiferet, the right leg, Hod. Netzach, the left leg, Hod. The phallus, Yesod, and then the womb, Malchut. And that mapping is a very central, and it's done because the Kabbalists it's a bit of a modern catchy term, but they're non-dualist. They believe that the psyche and the body are mirror images of one another, and therefore if this is the psychic structure, of course it's the bodily structure. It's a no-brainer for them.
Yeah. So how would you work with a system like that? Like, I know in the tantric in the tantric tradition, there's various meditations and visualizations and yogas and things like that people work through, let's say, provisional practices, which you understand that they're non-dual, that from an intellectual point of view, and then you work with all these provisional methods, to try to eventually realize that which is sort of already the case. But how would you work with that within your own tradition? Is it meditation, or is it like, do people? I know there's a book by Philip Kabbalah, I think, about meditation on the Kabbalah, but I'm wondering about the practices you do.
Yeah. What the Kabbalists do, which is very fascinating, and they do this in an extraordinary way, is they take all of Jewish practice that exists before them, which there's a tremendous amount of, and they remap the entire thing with their system. And I'm being a bit modern in my language. The Kabbalists believe that their system is the original mapping here. So however you want to see it, whether it's being done retrospectively or proactively, either way. But Judaism has a very, very complex and rich body of practice. We know that there are 613 commandments, which the rabbis read out of the biblical text, and these are all very much embodied commandments. They're how we dress and what we wear and how we eat and when we sleep and who we sleep with and when we work and how we don't work. And these are all very much commandments which are in the body, on the body, the mind, agricultural laws, economic laws. Judaism has a full social, psycho-spiritual practice, and the Kabbalists take this Sirodic reading and they read it into the commandments. So, for example, when we have a commandment to bind the tefillin, the leather wraps that men wear during prayer, on the left arm and then on the head, the Kabbalists have a very complex reading of why the left arm, why Gvura, what are the five fingers, the five aspects of Gvura, and why do we wrap the middle one? When we get dressed in the morning, according to halacha, according to literally the Jewish way, translated as law, but it's not law. Halacha means way, like halicha, walking, like the Tao. According to the Jewish Tao, according to halacha, when we get dressed, we begin by getting dressed with our right side of our body before our left, and that means that we're giving preference to chesed over gvura, to kindness before justice. And this is and so these are all, for the Kabbalists, these there's a million things that one does during their day as a practicing Jew that are imbued with the consciousness of this conscious reality, and that's from the order that we put our feet on the ground, to the hand which we use to wipe our bum on the toilet. It is to the intentionality of before whom we sit and stand, and these are all reflected in the body. And then at times, on specific occasions, when, for example, there's a festival which has a central mitzvah as part of that, like the Sukkot festival, the festival of booths, or the tabernacle, where practicing Jews will enter the sukkah and sit in the sukkah for a week. They have very, very complex readings of what exact spiritual, spherotic manifestation is taking place in the sukkah, and what happens when we enter that, and what is the act of eating in the presence of that specific gradation of being a divinity, and we take the four types of vegetation, the four species in the sukkah, and we shake them, and what does it mean to bind them? What is the lulav? What is the etrog? What is the hadas? What is the arava? Each one associated with one of the different worlds of the Kabbalah, different sferot. And I'm not really explaining here. All I'm saying is that every single aspect of Jewish life, which is very rich and complex and nuanced and detailed, becomes entirely reread through this practice. And what that affords is a capacity that every moment of one's life, from the moment when one is born and breathes their first breath to the very last breath which we breathe in our body, every single moment is a chance and opportunity for this awareness and for this presence and consciousness and for this active reunification of the cosmic masculine and cosmic feminine.
That's amazing. Yeah, it sounds like it's you don't need like any mindfulness apps. not necessarily. You won't need. You've got it all there already. Well, I was wondering about, I heard this term from, I once met Leonard Cohen, and he was enamored by a guy who was a Neo-Sabbatean, crazy rabbi fellow who was always talking about the difference between the oral Torah and the written Torah.
Right.
And he was saying that Jesus was a teacher of the oral Torah, right? Because it was beyond the law. It was completely spontaneous. So I wonder about that tension, and also as a non-Jew, one probably wouldn't want to enter into all those things unless you were really brought up in that world.
Right. It's an interesting use of that terminology, because the distinction between the oral Torah and the written Torah is a very basic distinction that's made throughout normative classic Jewish literature, going all the way back to the Talmud, which is to say, and there are many great thinkers of all streams and flavors who are going to be reading that distinction in creative and interesting ways. But the basic distinction is that the written Torah refers to primarily the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and the oral Torah refers to the body of interpretation through which we read those 5 books. To give some sort of parallel to that, in contemporary law, right? You have written law, you have constitutional law, and then you have case law. You have the way that we interpret a constitution, the way that we read a text. And the way that we read a text is as important, if not more important, than the text itself. And anyone who's aware of anything that's happened in literary theory for the past 50 years is very aware of that statement, to a strong degree. And Judaism is playing with this relationship between the written word and the spoken word, the constitutionalized letter and the interpretive letter very strongly. And to be rabbinic, to be a practicing Orthodox Jew today in a normative sense is to be a Jew who buys into this deep dance relationship between the written and the oral law. There have been groups of Jews historically that rejected this formulation, and basically said, we only want the written, we don't want the oral, pretty much like a Protestant saying, we only want the biblical text, sold us Torah, don't give us any interpretation. By and large, those Jews, they're historical phenomena, and they don't exist. I mean, there are small pockets of them, but when and people like the Samaritans and people like the Sadducees, these are groups that personify or typify that attitude, but that's there, and some of them still do exist, but not as a major force within contemporary Judaism, let's say. Contemporary Judaism is rabbinic in nature, and rabbinic means that it buys into this way that the text is read, and in some ways it's the only way we can read a text. We can't read a text without interpretation. It's a non sequitur, not to be disparaging to anyone who believes otherwise, but then this distinction is going to be spiritualized and read in very interesting ways, and I think the way that's going to be read is between this, like a dichotomy that we have between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. I think when we talk about Jesus as a teacher of the oral law, we're talking more about him, a teacher of the spirit of the law, and that's an important aspect, and it's an important idea in Judaism, that there is a letter of the law and that there is a spirit of the law, and this is an idea which finds its way into Jewish law itself. That if we only read the text with the letter itself and we ignore the spirit, then we've done a great injustice to the reality of Judaism, which is based on the spirit and not based on the letter.
Well, what about this notion of, let's say, heresy, right? Of stepping outside that, and is there a place for heresy at times when the letter of the law becomes too rigid and I think there's an antinomian tradition that kind of is always around the more mainstream rabbinical traditions, and heresy has a very, very fascinating and I would say tender place within classic rabbinic normative Judaism. There are great heretics, and I say great heretics because they're heretics that are held in very high esteem, and we teach our children about these great after
heretics.
the fact, right? I mean, They were
Right,
considered heretics
right.
at the time, and now they're great saints. And
Well,
this
no,
is
they're
often
not.
the case with religious figures everywhere.
No, they're not saints. No, you heard me wrong.
Not saints.
They're
Okay.
still heretics, but they're great heretics.
Okay.
Right. So, and the classic example of this is Elisha ben Avuya, who is a great Talmudic sage who apostatizes. He loses faith, and he's known as Acher. He's known as the other. But he's the teacher of Reb Meir. He's the teacher of one of the most quoted sages of the Talmud, who's so quoted that we don't even quote his name when we just, if there's an unauthored Mishnah, we know it's Reb Meir. That's how popular he is. And Reb Meir remains a devout student of Elisha ben Avuya, of the great heretic, deep into Elisha's apostasy, deep into his apostasy. He doesn't walk away. He doesn't jump ship when his teacher loses faith. The Talmud tells this. This is not some apocryphal text. The Talmud says that Elisha, the great sage who apostatized, and there's different reasons why. It's a complex story, a mythical story for some, a mystical story for others, that Elisha is desecrating the Shabbat. He no longer keeps the most basic of Jewish commandments that keep Jews alive until today. And he's riding on his animal on Shabbat, which is forbidden. And Reb Meir walks with him. He walks alongside the sage who is riding the animal. It's like, imagine the greatest Jewish sage today who is walking alongside his teacher who's driving their car on Shabbat, which is forbidden on Shabbat. And he's walking, he's listening to words of Torah. And words of Torah is not just scholasticism. Words of Torah are living words of God. They're the words that bring the world into existence. And he's receiving Torah from his master, who's an apostate, a heretic, riding on his animal on Shabbat. And in there, he's so lost in his conversation, he's so lost in the ecstasy of Torah, of this deep erotic relationship between teacher and student. Reb Meir himself forgets where he is, and Elisha, the heretic, reminds Reb Meir that he can't walk any further, even because he's crossed the boundary of Shabbat. It's an obscure law which most people don't know about because of the way that cities are built today. But in Talmudic times, you can't walk a certain distance out of a city on Shabbat. It's a biblical injunction today, because cities are so huge, you can't really walk out of a city. It's almost impossible. But in biblical times, in Talmudic times, you could very easily. And at a point of 2,000 amot, 2,000 arm breaths, you have to stop walking. You have to turn back. And Elisha reminds his student Reb Meir. He says, "Turn back. You can't walk any further. It's Shabbos." And Reb Meir tells him, "Come back with me. Come back with me," which means both literally walk back with me, but also metaphorically return with me. You care so much that even in the depths of this genius conversation, you remember to Shabbat. Come back. And Elisha says, "I can't come back because I heard from the voice of God's self, that I'm not wanted back." And very painfully, he tells his student Reb Meir, he says that we know, according to the Talmudic tradition, that there's a voice which emerges from Sinai or from the Temple Mount, depending on which text you're reading, and whether this is literal or metaphorical is not the question here. And the voice says, "Shuvu banim shevivim," return back, my wayward children. And this is the voice that we could say being utters all the time. We're being called back by reality to return to reality. And Elisha says that he heard that voice. And he heard an appellation at the end. He heard an appendix which says, "Shuvu banim shevivim chutz me'acher," return, my wayward children, besides for Acher, I don't want you back, is what he heard. And Reb Meir stops pestering him. He says, "Listen, if you heard God being itself say, 'Don't come back,' then fine." and get this, the Hasidic master say, my Rebbe says that Elisha ben Avuya, this great heretic, misunderstood what the divine was saying. Shuvu banim shevivim chutz me'acher means return back, my wayward children, chutz me'acher, and leave behind that self-conception of yourself that you think that you're an outsider, you think that you're an other. Let go of that and come back as a child, come back as banim. This whole idea of Joseph, that Joseph is called Joseph because Joseph means to add, lahosif, to add. Hosef li ben acher, another child was added to me, and therefore he's called Joseph. And the Kabbalists and Hasidic masters read this, that from the acher, from the other was made a child, was made someone who was beloved. And that's basically the idea. We think sometimes that we are great heretics, that we have gone too far. We have done things that make us irredeemable and unlovable. And the voice of God, the voice of being, of love, of whatever, however we translate that, tells us you're not lost, you're not an other, you're not a monster, you're a child of God, come back to me.
Yeah, I mean, what I could get from that is a different attitude than the attitude of original sin, where somebody is condemned.
Right.
You know,
No, we
condemned
don't.
for who they are. So
No, we don't do that. We don't do that so much.
which perhaps this is one of the reasons why somebody like me or other people would be kind of like, you know, listen to this tradition when you talk about it, even as an outsider, but still listen to it with a lot of joy because it's so because I don't know, because it's just seems to be profound.
I do believe that if we listen carefully to each of the great traditions that have been articulated throughout time, through our cultures, we'll find a tremendous amount of wisdom and profundity. And I try as best I can to bring the Jewish profundity to the table. But I know, and those who follow my work see that I'm trying to do that in conversation with very, very profound insights articulated by very beautiful brothers and sisters of Islamic faith, of Christianity, of Hinduism and Buddhism, and God forbid to disparage another faith for difference of opinion. And people of no faith at all. I think there's an immense profundity in science. I think there's immense profundity in plant medicine today. And I think that we have to listen. We have to be the wise person of the Mishnah who hears and learns from everyone. And I think that there's something very redemptive in that. I think the age of an elitist spirituality is long finished. To be and that's very 2021 or something. We need to do something new. We need a new spirituality, which is beyond, which is mystics without borders, and I hope to be a part of that.
That's a nice maybe moment to open open this conversation up to other people in the room. Yeah,
of course, with pleasure.
If anybody had some questions, or I got Hugo there. Do you want to unmute yourself and jump in, Hugo?
Yeah.
And if you have a camera, that's great. If you don't, never mind. But it's always nice to see people's.
We would love to see your face.
Oh, wait. Yeah. Wait. Just gonna sit. Wait. Can you see me? Wait, my webcam is pretty.
Beautiful.
You look like you're in the bathroom of an airplane or something.
Every face is the face of God, and when we get to share those faces with each other, there's something beautiful that happens.
Yeah. So I have a question for seekers of unity. Do you think it's necessary to learn Hebrew before you can properly understand the texts in the Old Testament? That's my question.
I think if someone is going to seriously consider studying any text in a serious way, there's going to be a prerequisite to understand the language of that text, and even in a contemporary, university setting, if you're going to be doing a PhD on Hegel, you're going to have to learn to read German before doing so, and that's a certain price that it costs, because you're never really reading a text. If you're reading a translation, you're reading a translation of the text.
Yeah. And
I think the same thing applies for the Bible, if not more so, because of how intricate the language is, and how deeply entwined language is with what it's trying to convey. I think one does need to learn Hebrew. Now, if one does not know Hebrew and they don't have a particular knack for languages or the time and capacity, does that mean they shouldn't read the text? No, it means that they can try and get as close as they can. But if one really wants to encounter the text firsthand, to have an intimate encounter with the text, one needs language. One needs, and I would say the same. I'd say this is particularly true for the Bible, but this is really true for any great text of history.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Please, Jacob. Yeah.
I can try to put my video on. My face looks a little weird, but that's a long story. You'll forgive me, I'm sure.
It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Amazing conversation. I think this was actually exactly the introduction I was hoping for to the mysticism of Judaism. Long story short, but I've had some dreams and stuff lately that called me to explore Judaism actually for some strange. I still don't know how to explain it. And then I just saw this in my Gmail today from you, Andrew. So that was perfect. I could ask a ton of questions, but I would like to return a little bit to the question that you asked earlier, Andrew, about how to practice this. And you did answer. I'm sorry, I missed your name, Seeker of Unity, but
Zevi.
Yeah. Zevi, thanks. You answered it a little bit, that it was embodied in the Torahs and which I think you described very beautifully, how this whole metaphysical understanding of the universe and all of these concepts are actually embedded in all the little practices that you do throughout any ordinary day. So, like, if I'm hearing you right, that your life becomes a ritual, basically.
Yes. Well said. Very well said.
Which is fascinating. But again, that means you have to like study all of those in details and maybe learn Hebrew and everything to be able to practice it. Like is there an easier way to access it, that you can start playing with as a non-Jew at this point?
Maybe we want to become Noahide Jews here. Do you know what that is? So there's like the Jews who are outside of the Jewish tradition who, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but
no. Yeah, it's a good question. Is there like a light version before you download the premium or the deluxe? It's an interesting question, and my initial reaction is no. Like, it really is a full system. And I think there's a mistake. Like, people want either the spirituality without the embodiment, or they want the practice without the spirituality. And the metaphor that's used, it's like having a flower without a pot plant. If you just have the pot plant, you just have a ball of dirt. If you just have a flower, it's going to die in 2 days. And they need to be in with one another. They need to be watered. They need sunlight. They need to be in an ecology that supports it, in a community. But I will say like this. There is, from a Jewish perspective, there are 613 commandments that apply to the Jew, but there are 7 commandments that apply to all humans, and this is what Andrew was referring to as the 7 Noahide laws. And these are sort of a mix of some basic theological principles and basic moral, ethical principles, and those would probably be a good place to start, and that may sort of shift into what Andrew was referring to as a movement today known as Noahide Jews. But even before going there, simply taking on the seven Noahide laws as they're known is and doing those. It's a very interesting project. I'm not going to go through what the 7 are. If you Google it, you'll find very quickly what they are. Yeah. But
can you write the name down in the chat so they have the spelling?
Sure.
Noahite. Yeah.
Just Noah. Yeah. 7 Noahide.
Like Noah, right? From Noah's Ark.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think it's about something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very interesting point here, which is that basically throughout Jewish history, Jews were basically on the short end of their neighbors, and we Jews have suffered a lot of persecution and expulsion, and that's been a staple of Jewish history. We live in a very unique moment in Jewish history where that's not the case as it's been historically, and thank God for that. And for that reason, with some historical, the real nerds of history will correct me here and there during the Roman Empire and whatnot. But basically speaking, Jews didn't really have much of a chance to share their wisdom with the outside world. They were basically just trying to survive in relation to the outside world. And what's happened now is a unique moment in history, and this also goes back to the beginning of our conversation, Andrew. Why Jews are sharing now But so this part of that is that this notion of the 7 Noahide laws was something which was not ever really actively promoted to the outside world by Jewish leaders or thinkers. In a kind of a interesting exception, the seventh mystical leader of the Hasidic dynasty, which I belong to, the current Rebbe, as it's referred to, began a campaign to teach these 7 Noahide laws to the wider world, and he wanted them to be taught through the lens of Jewish mysticism, through the lens of Hasidism and Kabbalah, which him calling for it, even calling for it to teach it, was very unusual and unprecedented. Calling for them to be taught through a mystical lens was very baffling and bewildering. And I can count on one hand how many people have taken up that initiative that the Rebbe instructed. And if I would count it, I would still have a few more fingers spare. And it's an interest, and I myself haven't considered it because it's for various strange and political reasons, which I won't get into, but maybe it is time, and I appreciate the question, Jacob. Maybe it's time for me to consider this directive of what it might mean to teach these 7 principles from the perspective of mysticism. So thank you.
And why would that be so unique, or what would be the other way to teach it?
Well, the basic way to teach it is that these are 7 ethical principles. They're very, very basic principles of how to treat our neighbors, how to treat animals, how to establish courts of law, and to get to the mystical beneath them would to do to these laws what the Kabbalists did to all of the mitzvot for the Jew. That they took practices which were just basic economic, agricultural, societal rites of passage, and they gave them deep mystical interpretations and meanings. And that's an interesting direction that I'll have to pursue.
Could you? Sorry if I keep on pushing you, but could you give just one example of how interpreting one of these noadic laws in a mystical way? How could that look?
You want me to start right now? You want me to do it?
Yeah. You're on a new mission now, Zevi. You're going to teach this to us, to Parallax Academy here. Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah, this is an interesting moment. Well, to begin from the beginning, the first of the 7 is to believe in God, and belief in God. To translate it into English as belief is a misnomer, because it's not belief. Emunah is not belief. Emunah is related to the Hebrew word omen, which means I'm going to throw out a bunch of English words here because it's kind of a linguistic cluster here. Art, trust, craft, practice, repetition, sort of in a manual sense. These are all words that are associated with emunah. To have faith or belief in Judaism is not to say I believe X, Y, Z. It is to artfully develop the practice of trust in a relationship, and that's what emunah means. And the first of the 7 Noahide laws is to have emunah in God and the unity of God. And the unity of God, as read through the mystics, is the unity of reality. So to begin, and that principle is really the beginning of everything. And for the Jew, that's also the beginning of everything. It's the first of the 10 Commandments, is Anochi, I am the Lord your God, is to enter into this relationship with the unity of reality in a way that takes constant practice and effort and artfulness. That's what I mean when I say to believe in God. That's how it would begin to be read properly, linguistically, mystically. And then we could continue through the commandments and go one by one and see how the latter 6 are trying to bring us to that original 7.
Well, perhaps that could be another conversation, Zevi, if you wanted to come back here.
It's going to take some work. I'm going to have to sit down with them and think about it. Yeah, but that would be interesting.
I would join for that one. Cool.
I wonder if your rabbi is trying to tell us that we have to abandon the sort of fundamentalist approach, and go to the deeper meaning of what it means to believe in God, because a lot of people declare that they believe in God and behave badly and do weird things, and what does it mean? And at all, it doesn't mean anything except a sort of tribal identification. usually.
Yeah,
and so what does that really mean is a very profound,
correct,
a mystical question.
That's exactly what it is. To say I believe in God from the mystic's perspective is to be affirming a radical life and way of being and relationship with reality that would be akin to something like Heidegger's Dasein. It's very much not saying I believe that 2 + 2 = 4. It's saying that I'm in a deep, active relationship, artful relationship with a conception of reality that demands something from me, and that obligates me to behave in certain ways and to be differently, to live artfully. That's what. It's a very, very different idea than what we think about in a Western context to believe, right?
Mm-hmm. I think Mila has a question. Do you want to jump in, Mila?
Thank you so much. This was absolutely delightful in the deepest sense of it. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a comment and that I want you to comment on in the spirit of a dialogic partner and a hermeneutic friend. And that's the gist of where I'm going with this right there, because you've spoken about bringing and uniting the hieros gamos that needs to happen daily, universally, right? This is
Absolutely.
the work. This is the labor of love,
Yes.
all puns intended.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm setting the stage a little bit. What I've noticed in all the mystical traditions is this love of the word, of the conversation, of the dialogue.
Mm.
And then the dialogue is meant to be paradoxical, to cause the delight in paradox. I'm still stuck on such delicious conversation about the greatest heretics.
Yes.
Of course, you have to be a genius of faith, the
Yes.
ultimate lover to break the rules. And by breaking them, affirm them par excellence. And I will never forget that story now that you shared. So I've noticed that in all mystical traditions, there's the spiritual koan, right? I mean, this is the fastest way to explain it. The delight of kneading the dough together, the delight of playing with words, the delight of spinning perspectives, the playing, the making love of labor and the labor of love, right? What's been fascinating to me is that there's a point at which one, along with the question that Hugo posed about how do you get in? Because you're so enticed, right, to get in. The question or the comment is there's a point at which you feel the Jew envy, which is a scary edge to tread, which I'm sure is one of the reasons that you've experienced what you've experienced, right? Minus the incarnation in the equation, but never mind all of that, right? Just what I'm saying, and the sense that the coding of the language that is given is one side, and it's the most powerful side, but also the mother's milk that the mother gives, right? That's why the Jewish mother, right? This is the writing with the light of the milk, writing in the DNA that is given to you. That's how you immediately initiate it, beyond the delight of the study and that you have to do later and all the rituals and everything. But what I'm saying is there's an envy at one point. And I'm wondering that, in the spirit of the work that you're doing right now, which is fascinating, where you were born, you were given this, and you say, not only is it the time and you've been also commissioned to do this. This is what's expected of you, but that you personally have discovered the conversation with other communities. And this is me going back to the hermeneutic friend, the dialogic partner, right? The point at which we need each other in conversation I'm trying to give back to myself a sense of dispensing of the envy and playing with that, right? Of saying there is the delight of separation in order to unite again. There's the task that I was given, the role that I was given to be born in a certain environment that is an assignment by God in order to meet you, in order to be met this way, and all for the exceptional delight, this exceptional delight that one senses, the sweetness of playing with ideas, with the words, with their concepts, in order to feel the might of paradox, which so satisfies the intellect. And in order to jointly induce an aesthetic state that gives the delight of being.
Yes. It's a great gift and honor and blessing to be alive in this moment that we are, to be able to be doing things like this, to use the tools that God has brought forth, that reality has bequeathed, that we could be in a conversation like this, that we could be in deep dialogue with souls and spirits and bodies and letters from across the world, and I'm very, very grateful to Andrew for hosting and facilitating this experience to encounter, and we encounter divinity when we open ourselves up to each other, to that experience where we leave our own isolation and echo chambers, and we listen deeply, and we hear, and when we listen deeply, we bring the other into being, if we can listen intensely enough, and it's bringing God into being. It's bringing the full manifestation, so that every face and every voice of God can be articulated, and only then do we have the full chorus of reality. And it's in the word, and it's in the milk, and it's in the paradox, and it's in the logical, and it's in the paradox. And there's a great line from a sage who I never would have been exposed to had it not been for the mediums and opportunities that we have today as 21st century seekers. Nicholas of Cusa, the 13th century Christian sage and saint, who said that God is none other than the none other. It is none other than that which is always none other. And this deep delight of the paradox is so central and so delightful, because reality is paradoxical. I mean, we see nothing without light, and for God's sake, scientists cannot figure out what the hell light is. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is it both? Is it neither? It's the most fundamental constant and construct of reality, when we have no freaking idea what it's. We bathe in the paradox, and this quest of the modern rationalist to be beyond contradiction and paradox is just an escapist attempt to not face reality itself, which is just deeply interwoven with paradox. And I'm very thankful to Mila for bringing our appreciation to the dialogue and to the paradox and to that encounter itself. Thank you, Mila.
Thank you so much. I'm just thinking about the implications of all of this for peace, because this is fundamental in the sense that we belong to each other. You said that earlier. We belong to each other unavoidably. And to think of these different communities, mystical communities, even the closed ones, like I said, the Druze, or that you just have to be born into it, and this is their rule. And even if you feel that you're outside of it, just the sheer fact that you are the holder of a knowledge and a mystery that is unique to the community. Let's just say it's a unique frequency. And so you're holding the key with all the puns of frequency under the key to the doorway and everything. that separation is the precondition for your efforting towards me, to explain to me of your community.
Yeah.
And to hold that paradox as the separation is the precondition for our union, for seekers of the union. As long as we seek each other, as long as we seek that, we're efforting towards each other. If it were not that, there would not be an endeavor, an effort.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
If we could convey this to people, that how we belong to each other in a deeper sense, and that the separation is a necessity of consciously reaching for each other, into each other, towards each other. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. And thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
I know that's absolutely true. There's a very, very profound set of ideas in the Kabbalistic universe of the separation of Adam and Eve. The according to the biblical narrative as it's read, that they were created as one entity and they were separated into masculine and feminine. And that act of separation is exactly what you're describing, is the precondition for reunion is separation, is otherness, and that otherness and sameness and unity and diversity are two sides of one coin, that they're not this in this dualism that we think that they're in. This and that's very true. I also want to say in a very practical sense, because sometimes we can be so intoxicated and inebriated by the ideas that we forget the real concerns. And I live in a country where there's a tremendous amount of ignorance and animosity and hatred and violence that one child of God is perpetuating against another child of God, and in all directions, and that is the greatest insanity. That is the greatest insanity. It is the self harming the self, and if a person harms themselves, we put them in a straitjacket and we chuck them into a rubber room, and that's what humanity is doing to itself. And we as mystics have to be ambassadors for peace, very, very practically. I did work here through the channel of visiting. You mentioned the Druze, visiting the local Druze community, visiting the Ahmadiyya, visiting the Caucasian, visiting my local Muslim brothers and sisters, and finding ambassadors for peace on the other sides of these fake walls that we put between ourselves. So I just want to say, in addition to the philosophizing and the words and the dance, which is so important, we must also practically stand up for peace and for unity and for understanding, because if the mystics are silent, then who is going to speak up?
And that's another paradox, because it's the silence, in fact, that is the space between us, which allows for the unity.
I have a question for Andrew. If that's okay, Andrew.
What's that? Yeah.
Yes, I have a question for you.
For me, okay, yeah.
Yes. What got you interested in Buddhism in the beginning, and what would you say led up to this point?
Into Buddhism? Well, when I was a student in Montreal, I was kind of lost and wandering, and I had done psychedelics, and I had all these experiences and strange experiences, and I was fragmented in every kind of direction. And one of my professors was a Rinzai monk who had just come back from Japan, who was teaching meditation. So I used to go and sit with him in the mornings in the chapel and chant in Japanese, and sit in silent meditation. So as soon as I did that, I just loved it so much, because it was just sitting in silence. I didn't care about, there was a beauty to that, which I hadn't found anywhere in my own tradition. Like I hadn't met people in my own tradition who did that. So I would say that I didn't become a Buddhism because I wanted to be a Buddhism with a capital B. I was like, okay, this is the coolest philosophy. Of course, we all go through a kind of like fundamentalist period where we think that about our own tradition because we love it so much. But I think it was mostly the people I met. It was mostly, to be religious about it, I could say it was mostly grace. It was mostly just what came upon me in certain moments. And then again, it doesn't matter to be a Buddhist with a capital B at all. It matters the teachers that I've met, and the profundity of what they're transmitting. So this is why I like to speak. I'm not a kind of a Buddhist that wants to be enclosed in any Buddhist. I like to speak to people from all different, traditions. Why I really want to speak to Zevi, for instance. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question, or you?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I think Aeneas had a question, or Aeneas and Johnny, or it was Johnny. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Zevi. That's great. Yeah, I've got actually two things I'd like to highlight and formulate a question. First of all, I was a bit astounded by your no in terms of getting into the Kabbalah and having like a fully present awareness of the day unfolding before you in every moment, every instance. So I wonder that, and I wonder because I have read a bit on the Kabbalah and also the tradition, the Jewish tradition, and one of the striking things that was very helpful for me was to understand that the Yud, the first symbol of the Hebrew alphabet, is actually a flame. It's so that helped me because I would consider myself a natural philosopher, and I've read a fair amount of alchemical text, and so like how important is the natural philosophical I think you get my question. Is like I believe that like a lot of the indigenous peoples and tribes still busy within their mythological and magical systems, a natural philosophy that allows them to really be at one with reality and experience it in the now. So that's one I would like you to comment on, in as much as though that there might be ways in which also like you can inform people through ways of experience, right? And then use like subliminal invisible tools, but that to enhance that presence experience of and the dance of the masculine and feminine by using the elements natural philosophy. The second part, second comment or question I have is about the grand narrative and the evolution of consciousness and like religious traditions and wisdom traditions evolving, and then also like in relation to the Trinity and the Virgin Mary and Jung commenting on the quaternity. I think we're moving into the quaternity. This is what Jung was saying, and I've read this beautiful book by Robert A. Johnson, which is a neo-Jungian and a great scholar of this, and he was speaking about how Goethe writes in Faust this going from three. The first part of Faust is describing the three-dimensional state of the let's say at least the Western consciousness, and that the second part of Faust is the struggle of him trying to get into the quaternity. Anyway, I want to put that, what I want to put on top is the Ian McGilchrist, where we're the science, the left, it's the third, like it's bulging into, let's say, the right hemisphere, the quaternity. And so I wonder what that brings up for you, and how those two things can help us become more present of what's going on, what's unfolding before us, right? Because I feel like another thing that you said was like the failing God, and I made a note of it. I think nature, reality, is trying to know itself. It's experimenting itself through each of us, and then anyway, that's what I have to offer, and I wonder what comes up for you.
Right. I missed your name.
Johnny. Sorry, Johnny.
Johnny.
Thanks for asking, Johnny.
Thank you, Johnny. You have a very rich and associative mind, and I'd like to ask to hear a re-articulation of that question.
Okay. Yeah.
I think every time that you would re-articulate it, it would come out something new. If I can preempt that, and I'm hearing the sort of dance on the line between the dynamism of the divine and the presence of the absolute. Is that am I on the right track there?
Well, like, no, I don't think that's the right distinction. What I was getting at is like how the first thing I was getting at is how our language, our symbols, but how consciousness is light, and that the first sign of the Hebrew alphabet is the Yud, which can be, I've read, to be represented as a flame. So by sitting around a campfire looking into the flames, I believe that's definitely an entry point for how to become present and appreciative of the day that's been and the day that will come, the night that is apparent, sitting around that. So there's ways in which the natural philosophy for me, and just that's one part that I don't think I would have to known Hebrew to understand. So, I have tried to study a bit, but not really like years on end and days on end. And so it's not that, but I wonder if it has to be that harsh, because you gave the Gevura no, you have to do it. But I wonder if there's ways in which these 7 laws of Nochad may, in a mystical sense, invite people, and the second part is what do you think on this grand narrative, like the evolution of consciousness?
Okay. I appreciate the re-articulation. Let me quantify or qualify the no that I gave. I gave that no to Hugo's question and also in some sense to Jacob's question. I maybe missed saying something, and what I missed to say was that I really don't think that the only way to the presence of the divine is through the Hebrew Bible or through Judaism or through halakha, through Jewish ritual. I really believe that there's 1,001 ways to get to what we call God, to get to being, to get to that which always is. Even the Talmud says, a very classic rabbinic text, Harbe drachim lamakim, in a very beautiful play with the Hebrew, there are many ways to the omnipresent, literally to the place, to that which is everywhere. There are many ways to get everywhere. And the reason why I'm exercising Gevura and saying no here is because I don't think that someone needs to do it Jewishly. Right. I think firstly one can do it Buddhistly, Christianly, Hindu, Muslim, like through so many ways, Taoistly, through native shamanistic traditions, or through no. I mean, it helps to have a spiritual tradition and grounding and practice, but one can do it also through philosophy and self-exploration and psychedelics and love and dance and there's so, I mean, there's 1,000,001 ways to get to that which is everywhere, and that's why I'm saying no. I'm not saying no, God forbid, to close the door on someone's access to that which is always accessible, but simply to say that you don't need to follow this path and this path. If you do want to do it through this path, then there are requirements and there are specific ways to get there. If you want to reach ecstasy through athleticism, which is a very profound thing, there's this great idea that when we watch a sport, when we watch someone at the height of their athletic career, right? We we see the divine manifest in them in the height of their athletic achievement. When you see a soccer player at the height of their career, or a surfer deeply in the flow in relationship, what we're seeing as well is spirit. That's a spiritual ole 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 ole, right? We call out during sports. It's Allah 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 Allah. We're seeing the divine, right? That's what we're seeing. That's Elizabeth Gilbert. I think that's where I got that from. So firstly, that's why I'm exercising a bit of vura, because if you're going to do it, if you're going to get to divinity through surfing, right, you can't skip the first 10 stages. You have to know how to body paddle and how to catch the wave and how to pop up, and you can't just say, sure, just jump in a board and I'll throw you out into a 10-foot wave and you'll be fine. It's like, no, if that's your path, then you're gonna have to.
I get that, but okay, so can I just interject slightly?
Sure.
I think the original mystics, shamanistic mystics, and as they evolved, they're just trying to make sense of their experience, right? So that's how they create the schema, this mystical tradition. So it's from their experience that they've created. Right. So I believe that there's other traditions which you could study, or even really you need to focus on one, really get into it, and maybe then generate that relationship with God and have a mystical experience and build on that. But you can also, I think there's also ways in which you can actually just have that mystical experience and then later come to a tradition, trying to make sense of it and say, hey, that clicks, tick, tick, boom. Oh my God. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I think those are both, it's true what you're saying. They're both very, very legitimate. And I think that the mystics are doing that for themselves, and they're building those systems. And I think that we can have those experiences and then find bits of tradition or atraditional traditions, which then give us context and grounding and practice for those experiences. And that's important to have. And that's right. That can be both directions. In terms of the, I just want to make a comment on what you said in terms of the flame, the yud. The yud is typically the 10th character of the Hebrew alphabet. But the first character of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the aleph, the alpha, the A, is made up of 2 yuds and a vav between them. And what that represents, according to the Kabbalists, is the yud is the singularity. It's the infinitesimal point, and it's 2 singularities. It's 2 infinitesimal points, like these 2 black holes, and between them is the vav that separates and connects them. And there's a lot to be said in that, and there's a lot that's happening in the flame and in the dance of those letters, and the letters of the Torah are called black flames on white flames, and there's these profound descriptions of times where Torah scrolls were burnt by enemies of the people, and the flames were seen, the fire, the black letters were seen floating back up to the black fire above, that they're immortal, eternal letters, and that fire is there, and that fire dances before our eyes when we pay attention to it, and we see letters in the flames and flames in the letters. In regards to the second point you said of the evolution of consciousness, there has been interesting work done on that front. The 2 most obvious examples there's a text from Richard Maurice Burke. Is that, I think that's how it's pronounced, or Burke, something like that. Who was a Canadian psychologist writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he wrote a very interesting work. I haven't seen it discussed much in contemporary circles, but he wrote one of the early classic works at the times, when Otto was writing and James was writing on mysticism, and it's called, the name of the book is the Cosmic Consciousness. I think that's the name of the book.
Oh, yeah, rings a bell.
And the truth is, it's obscure in some circles. I'm sure in other circles it's more well known. It's probably being read in various communities. He posits a very elaborate theory, and building in some ways on the work that the Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Duchardin Taylorhart did in his book, the Omega Point. the phenomenology of man, which he posits this theory of the omega point, which is also an important work, and he does this in a bit more detail than what Teilhard does, and he goes through different mystics historically, and he sees them as, he has this Darwinian sort of evolutionary concept, and the mystics throughout history are kind of the crest of the wave of human consciousness evolving forward, and they're showing the direction of where we're moving towards. What James does in a kind of moral sense, he does in a evolutionary consciousness sense, and I think it's fascinating what he does. His selection of who's a mystic. He has a whole chapter there on Balzac, the great poet. It's a very fascinating selection of characters that you wouldn't see in a contemporary anthology of mystics. It's his own sort of strange collection of people. I think it's very fascinating. It's very interesting. It's somewhat antiquated. Scientifically and whatnot. There's also a bit of a danger to it, in this assumption that somehow the mystic is better than the average human, and that has to be dealt with carefully, and not led, because that could lead to hubris and ego and narcissism and misunderstanding. So it's a delicate point. The point which I'm trying to get to is that there's a balance and paradox here, which is between the evolutionary, and this is what I thought initially you might have been sort of gesturing towards. There has to be a balance between the evolutionary, the progress movement, that there is a telos, and we're progressing towards it, and the realization that which is always is and never can be otherwise, and those two have to be held constantly in tension with one another. And that's what I'm trying to say. And the metaphor which comes to mind as a practicing Jew is the relationship between the 6 days of the working week and the 7th day of rest, Shabbat. And rest means that everything ceases to be. There's this sort of quantum rest where there's no movement, there's no fixing, because there's nothing to fix. There's a perfect balance and equilibrium, and that is Shabbat, and that is the messianic state. And then there's the 6 days of the week, where in those 6 days there's movement and there's activity and there's action, and each day is one of the Sfirot. The 7th is Malchut again, right? And this balance between we keep cycling the Jewish ritual cosmic life. This I think it was Jacob who put it as this life of ritual, and this ritual of life is this constant cycling between the cyclical and the eternal, between the progressive and the unmoving, between the need to correct and fix, and to tikkun olam, to repair the world, and the realization that there's nothing to fix and there never was anything to fix. And it's that constant, and the ritual that inaugurates that moment is twofold. We go into Shabbat with Kiddush, we sanctify the day, and we go out of Shabbat with Havdalah, we sanctify the week, we separate them. And that's a very, very powerful psychological experience for a practicing Jew when done right, of stepping over the boundaries and borders of that immense paradox on a weekly basis. And that's what I wanted to say, that tension, when we talk about the evolution of the mystic, the telos, the goal, it has to be always kept in balance with the Shabbat model, where there's no one's more enlightened than anyone, and no one's getting anywhere. It's all here, all now, and those two are two paradoxical truths which must always be held together.
Zevi, I wonder if we could perhaps, like, we're moving towards the hour, but I noticed that Yusuf has a question, and he hasn't. And we have a nice small group here, and it's nice that everybody is kind of participating. So I wonder if we could have a final question from Yusuf before closing off the evening, if that would Please. Be okay with everybody.
With pleasure, yeah.
Do you want to jump in there? Yusuf, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yusuf, yes, greatly appreciated. Thank you. Yeah, this was a fun way to spend 2 hours of work. For sure.
You're at work.
Yeah, I'm in Arizona. So in the spirit of finding peace in the Middle East, I was hoping to hear you talk a little bit about Islam and maybe your conversations with some of the other. I like your channel a lot, and I've seen some of the conversations you've had with some of the other mystics, the Sufi mystics. But as far as I'm aware, Sunni Sufi Islam seems to be the largest mystical current on earth.
Hmm.
I might be wrong, but it seems to be the case.
Hmm.
Also seems to be one of the most dogmatic at the same time. Does not allow for a lot of this kind of freedom. So I guess I'd be curious to hear a little bit about, what you see for the future of this path and how this might unfold.
That's a really great question. I appreciate it, Yusuf. The short answer is I have no idea. I can barely even speak about my own tiny community, let alone a huge community of brothers and sisters spread across the globe. I've no idea. I have no idea. I mean, I can talk about where I might like it to go, where I might like to see things develop. That we can talk aspirationally. I can't really predict or forecast. There's been interesting work done since about the 13th century until today to try and build mystical fraternity between Jewish and Islamic communities. And when you say the word Islam and I hear a pronunciation of someone who I assume speaks Arabic or at least Fusa or something,
yes.
That it reminds me to the etymology of Islam, which is to submit, to surrender before God, and the etymology of Yahud, of Jew, which is to give thanks, to give praise to God, Hoda'ah, and to bring in the mystical side. Hoda'ah, Hod, the sphere of Hod, one of the Sphirot, is submission. That's what it is, and which is a cheeky way to say that from the mystical perspective, the Yahud, the Hoda'ah, and the Islam, the submission, are really not too far from one another. If you just peel back the thinnest veneer of etymology, you see what's going on there, and the sense that for the mystic, anyone who submits to God, who surrenders before God, is a Yahud and is an Islam, is a Muslim. So that's an important point. But this is not just wordplay. This is also history, right? I've done work on the channel, as you may know, looking at the greatest philosopher in Jewish history, if you're not counting Spinoza, is Maimonides. And Maimonides' very own son, right? Maimonides, who writes one of the most codifying, authoritative, lasting works of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, which is still intensely studied until today. Also writes a great work of perhaps the greatest work of Jewish philosophy, the Guide to the Perplexed, which we spend a lot of time on the channel trying to unpack the mystical insight. His own son, Abraham Maimonides, is deeply infatuated, to say the very least, with his mystical Sufi brothers and sisters, and works a lot to try and find the traditions of the prophets of Israel that have been safeguarded by the mystical fraternities in Islam, and tries to bring them back into Jewish practice. And he writes a great work, Hamaspik Le'Eved Hashem, the encyclopedia for the servant of God, where he tries to weave these two faiths together. And there's a lot of fascinating academic work being done on that mystical moment in the 13th century. There's been some great work done by Alicia Fishbane, by Dan Lobel. There's been some really good work that one can find, and that continues all the way until today, where you have one of my own spiritual mentors who I never met in the flesh, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who worked towards a mystical fraternity together with Sufi brothers and sisters to try and bring these deep mystical traditions back into a deep relationship with one another, and that work is so important and so critical, and it's important for many reasons. It's important because firstly, there's this very painful and dangerous misconception that people of faith have to be at each other's throats, and that you have to be wrong for me to be right, and it's a conception which leads to violence and bloodshed, and when religion gets tied into power and politics, that only becomes all the more explosive, and so firstly, the work has to be done to diffuse that, and to say, like, like khalas. That's not how it works. That we're here to be ambassadors of peace, and the truth and the devotion and the conviction and the passion of the other does not take away from my own passion and devotion. It only strengthens it and empowers it. Zalman Schachter Shalomi, a great pioneer of this intramystical peace fraternity, called this spiritual voyeurism, that we can get off by watching how the Muslim worships God, and I can take back some of that to my own worship. And I mean, just such a beautiful term, and he upset so many people with it, which is great. So this is a very new paradigm of religion. He called it the Aquarian Age because he was a bit of a hippie, but we can find ways to, and there are people that are continuing his path, and I hope to be among them. That's firstly why, and secondly, because there's a great I believe it's a Buddhist metaphor of the blind man groping the elephant, right? And some of the practicing Buddhists here may know the details better than I do. I'm looking from the outside here. I'm a blind man myself, as it is. But there's a bunch of blind men in a room, and they're holding on. There's this behemoth elephant in the middle of the room, and they're each grabbing a part of the elephant, and they don't know that there are more parts of it, and each one is convinced that what they're holding is the entirety of the elephant, and they're trying to guess what's in the room based on what they're holding. So one of them, or a few of them, are convinced that there's a tree trunk in the room because they feel the leg of the elephant. The other one thinks that there's a rope hanging from the ceiling because they feel the tail. The other one thinks that there's a big floppy something because they feel the trunk, and the other one grabs the ear, and each one is so convinced, and they could come to blows. They're so convinced. And the reality is that they're all blind, and they're all obviously groping this one big elephant, and this is the elephant in the room. And we humans are blind, trying to grope. We're trying to grope at the divine. We're trying to grope at the absolute, which is the elephant in the room. And our hands are only so big. We can only hold on to one part at a time. But what we can do is, instead of me holding my part and yelling at the person holding the other part, "You're wrong. You're an idiot. You're a kafir. You're a heretic." Instead, let's go into dialogue. And if you can explain to me what do you feel? What are you tasting? What's the dalk of the Sufi? What's the beatific vision of the Christian? What is the nirvana of the Buddhist? Then we can begin to get a sense of what the elephant is, because then we can all bring our parts together. And it's not just that. It's not just that we can stop killing each other and ourselves, but we can also begin to grapple with the mystery and get a hand on the mystery and dance with the elephant. And it's not just, I want to include, it's not just the faiths. You know who else is in the room grabbing the elephant? It's the scientist, and it's the astronomer, and it's the physician, and it's the mathematician, and it's the artist. And we need to begin to be in conversation, and we need to figure out how do we get a hold of this thing. And get a hold of it means, how do we live in alignment with it? How do we live with the beast, with the beauty that's in the room? And we need each other for that. We're blind and without each other, and we need each other. We need to be each other's hands and eyes, groping the mystery of being.
You said the beast and the beauty. I wonder if that was an intentional, because it almost sounded like a slip, but
it was an intentional slip.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I think this, we did it. I think this was wonderful. Of course, I have 10 more questions for you, but I think when the conversation ends with this kind of frustration that there's 1,000 other things to unpack, that means that hopefully we can continue this conversation, if you would ever be willing to grace us with your presence again, because I would reiterate what Mila said. This was very delightful, Zevi, and I'm really glad I reached out to you, and thanks so much.
I'm very appreciative. More than the child needs to suckle, the mother needs to give, and thank you for inviting me into that.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Zevi. Amazing. Thank you, Andrew.
Good night, everyone.
Yusuf. Thank you.
See you, everybody.
Goodness, thank you, Mila. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Andrew.
Peace,
Thank you,
shalom.
Zevi.
We all say yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Yeah.